The cold did not merely surround the men of the 101st Airborne, it inhabited them. It was a penetrating, existential chill that seeped through wool coats, froze boot leather solid, and made the very air a crystalline enemy. This was the Ardennes forest in December 1944, a place of primordial, snow-blanketed silence that had been shattered by the thunder of the last, desperate German offensive. What would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was not a conventional battle of lines and maneuvers, it was a chaotic, brutal struggle for survival against an enemy, the elements, and a creeping sense of dread. The forest itself seemed haunted, not by spectral figures, but by the ghosts of shattered expectations and the specter of a sudden, shocking defeat. Just weeks before, the Allied High Command had been buoyed by optimism. The headlong rush from the Normandy beaches across France had suggested a war that might be over by Christmas. The Ardennes, a densely wooded, hilly region stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg, was considered a ghost front, a quiet sector where battered American divisions were sent to rest and green units were blooded in relative safety. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Germans, under the direct command of Adolf Hitler, had massed their finest remaining panzer armies and infantry divisions in secret. Their target, this very, impassable, terrain. Their goal, to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The offensive, launched on December 16, fell upon the unsuspecting Americans with the force of a blizzard. German panzers, spearheaded by the fearsome King Tigers, emerged from the morning mists, their gray uniforms making them ghosts in the fog. They were the veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened, ruthless, and driven by a final, fanatical hope. Against them stood a scattered collection of American units, some, like the 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions, were already worn thin from the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, others were raw, unprepared. The initial shock was catastrophic. Units were overrun, command posts were captured, and the front line, quite literally, bulged inward under the weight of the assault. But amidst the chaos, pockets of American resistance solidified. They were islands in a grey German tide. They held crossroads like St. Vith, buying precious time with their lives. And they fortified a small, otherwise insignificant Belgian town with 7 roads radiating from its center like spokes on a wheel, Bastogne. Into this town marched the men of the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other stragglers. They were not there to win a glorious victory, they were there to hold. To not move. To become a rock. The commander of the German XLVI Panzer Corps, General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, saw the stubborn American resistance as an absurdity. On December 22, he sent a party under a flag of truce to the American lines outside Bastogne. The message they carried was delivered to the American commanders, including Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st. It was a masterpiece of martial condescension. It spoke of the hopeless situation of your troops, describing the American force as encircled. It presented a stark choice, surrender or annihilation. The language was not merely a demand, it was a mockery. The mighty Wehrmacht, with its encircling armies and its battle-hardened troops, was mocking the trapped Americans. The American response would become the stuff of legend. When the surrender ultimatum was presented to McAuliffe, he initially scoffed, "Ah, nuts." Struggling to formulate a more formal reply, his staff settled on that single, perfect, contemptuous word. The reply, typed up and delivered to the bewildered German envoys, read, to the German commander, "Nuts." The American commander. It was more than a refusal, it was a statement of defiance that echoed from the frozen foxholes of Bastogne to the highest echelons of command. It was the spirit of the Bulge, a refusal to acknowledge the ghost of defeat. And so, the stage was set. The 101st and their comrades were completely surrounded. Low on ammunition, medical supplies, and, most critically, winter clothing and food. The cold was a relentless, silent killer. Men lost fingers to frostbite, foxholes became icy tombs, and the wounded often froze to death before they could be evacuated. The gray overcast sky was their ceiling, a lid on their coffin. They were the besieged, the mocked, the seemingly doomed. The ghosts of the Bulge were not just the memories of the initial attack, but the very real, very present phantoms of starvation, hypothermia, and a crushing military defeat that loomed over the entire Western Front. They were holding on, but a holding action could not last forever. They needed a miracle. They needed a deliverer. And one was already on his way, his eyes fixed on the map, his mind racing, his will a force of nature as formidable as the winter storm itself. His name was George S. Patton. The encirclement of Bastogne was not a simple drawing of a line on a map. It was the slow, methodical tightening of a noose, a strategic and psychological reality that pressed in on the 18,000 American soldiers and their attached units from all sides. To be trapped is one thing, to be besieged in the heart of a European winter, with the certainty of a relentless enemy and the uncertainty of rescue, is another form of warfare entirely. This was a battle against isolation, against dwindling hope, and against the very elements that seemed to have allied themselves with the German war machine. The German ring around Bastogne was porous at first, a loose cordon that allowed for some daring resupply by glider and the infiltration of small groups of replacements. But with each passing day, from that fateful December 20th, the circle hardened. German artillery, mortars, and assault guns took up positions on the high ground surrounding the town, looking down into the American perimeter. The 7 vital roads that made Bastogne a strategic prize, the very reason for their stand, were now all cut, each one covered by German armor and machine gun nests. The Americans inside did not control the roads, they were an island, and the German tide controlled every channel. Within the perimeter, a grim new economy took hold. Ammunition was rationed with painstaking precision. Artillery shells, the one thing that could keep the German infantry at bay, were counted and recounted. The order went out, hold your fire until you see the whites of their eyes. It was a sentiment belonging to a different century, but it was the brutal reality of Bastogne. Medical supplies became worth their weight in gold. The aid stations, set up in cellars and sturdy buildings, were overflowing with casualties. The 2 key commodities were plasma and morphine, and both were running out. Doctors and medics, working by the dim light of lanterns, performed triage under the constant shudder of artillery impacts, making impossible decisions about who could be saved and who was too far gone. But it was the cold that was the most democratic and insidious enemy. The temperature hovered well below freezing. Men lived in foxholes, which they lined with frozen straw and whatever wood they could scavenge. To fall asleep for too long was to risk freezing to death. Frostbite was a universal affliction, men's boots froze to their feet, and removing them often meant tearing away skin. The standard issue trench foot, a debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and cold, crippled more men than German bullets. Food was scarce. K-rations were stretched, and hot meals were a distant memory for most. The few working field kitchens could only produce a thin, watery stew, but it was a taste of warmth that felt like a blessing. The psychological toll was immense. The constant, grinding anxiety of being surrounded, of knowing that there was no rear area, no safe haven to retreat to, wore on every man. The sky, when it was visible, was either a leaden gray, promising more snow, or filled with the menacing whine of German aircraft, not the large bombers, but the nimble, terrifying Jabos, German ground attack planes that strafed and bombed anything that moved. The nights were worse. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the flash of artillery and the eerie floating light of German flares, which would illuminate the snow-covered landscape in a ghostly greenish-white light, signaling an impending infantry attack. Communication with the outside world was the fragile thread upon which their sanity and their strategy hung. Radio batteries were dying, and the shelling often cut telephone lines as soon as they were laid. The men inside the pocket knew they were the focus of the world's attention, but they felt utterly alone. They heard the broadcasts of Axis Sally, the German propaganda radio host, whose sultry voice would slither through the ether into their radios. "Well, you boys of the 101st in Bastogne," she would croon, "we have you surrounded. Why not give up this foolish fight? How would you like some white bread for Christmas? Or would you prefer to be dead?" Her mockery was a weapon, designed to amplify their isolation and break their spirit. Yet, it was within this cauldron of misery that the American defiance was forged into something unbreakable. That nuts response was not just a headline for the newspapers back home, it was a daily creed. It was the spirit of the machine gunner who held his fire until the German skirmish line was a mere 50 yards away, then cutting them down in swathes. It was the courage of the medics who ran through open fields under fire to reach a wounded comrade. It was the ingenuity of the engineers, who laid intricate networks of mines and booby traps with their dwindling supplies, making the perimeter a deadly labyrinth for any German assault. They were an army trapped by geography and enemy action, but they refused to be trapped in spirit. They had transformed their defensive perimeter from a simple line of resistance into a fortress of will. Every frozen foxhole was a citadel, every snow-covered hedgerow, a rampart. They held the town, but more importantly, they held the attention of an entire German army that should have been racing towards the Meuse River. They were a rock, but a rock being relentlessly pounded by a storm of steel and ice. They could hold, but they could not hold forever. The noose was tight, and the air was getting thin. The trapped army awaited a sound, the distant thunder of guns from the south, the promise of the Third Army, and the man who had promised to deliver them, Patton. The encirclement of Bastogne was not merely a tactical objective for the German High Command, it was a psychological weapon, and they wielded it with calculated, Teutonic precision. The trapped Americans were more than just an enemy force to be destroyed, they were a symbol to be broken, a narrative to be written in the annals of propaganda. The mockery was not a mere byproduct of their situation, it was a deliberate, multifaceted campaign designed to shatter the will of the defenders and demonstrate to the watching world the impotence of the Allied war machine. The eagles of the 101st Airborne, the screaming hawks emblazoned on their shoulders, were to be plucked and humiliated. This psychological warfare operated on several distinct levels, each more insidious than the last. The most pervasive was the voice that came through the ether, a siren song of despair from the radio personality known as Axis Sally. Her real name was Mildred Gillars, an American-born broadcaster for the German Reichsrundfunkgesellschaft. To the shivering, isolated men in their foxholes, her voice was a ghost in their midst, an intimate intruder who knew their fears and exploited them with chilling accuracy. Her broadcasts were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She would play popular American music, Glenn Miller, Bing Crosby, songs of home and hearth that twisted in the gut of a homesick soldier. Then, her smooth, almost sympathetic voice would slide in. "Good evening, fellows of the 101st, she would begin, as if addressing old friends. I hope you boys are staying warm in your little frozen foxholes around Bastogne. Do you know what the German High Command is calling you now? They're calling you the battered bastards of the Bastogne pocket. It has a certain ring to it, don't you think?" She would detail the German panzer divisions surrounding them, listing their numbers and their battle honors from the Eastern Front, a not-so-subtle reminder of the overwhelming force poised to crush them. "Your situation is hopeless," she would purr. "Why die for a piece of frozen mud? Your generals have abandoned you. Eisenhower is warm in Paris. Patton is stuck in the mud. Surrender, and you will have warm food, a cot, and you will see the end of this war. You have until Christmas. After that, annihilation." But the mockery was not confined to the airwaves. It was written in the sky and screamed from the ground. The Luftwaffe, though a shadow of its former self, maintained local air superiority over the pocket. German Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter bombers would scream down out of the low clouds, strafing and bombing the American positions with impunity. The men on the ground, with their scant anti-aircraft defenses, felt a profound vulnerability. The enemy owned the sky above them, a constant, visible reminder of their cut-off state. After a strafing run, a pilot would sometimes waggle his wings, a gesture of contemptuous triumph. From the German ground forces came a more primal form of taunting. During the eerie lulls between infantry assaults, German soldiers, hidden in the tree lines just a few hundred yards away, would use loudspeakers. Their voices, distorted and metallic, would echo across the silent, snow-filled fields. "GI. You are surrounded. Your Thanksgiving turkey is cold. Your Christmas will be your funeral. They would sometimes imitate the voices of American officers, shouting false orders to retreat or to abandon posts, creating confusion and paranoia. They knew the 101st was low on supplies, and they would mock their hardship. We have warm schnapps and sausage. You have frozen K rations. Come over to our side. We will feed you. This constant barrage of psychological pressure was designed to exploit the most fundamental fears of a soldier, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of being outmatched, and the fear of a meaningless death. The German command, particularly General von Luttwitz, was a firm believer in the concept of Schwerpunkt, the point of maximum effort. At Bastogne, the Schwerpunkt was not just physical, but mental. They aimed to convince the Americans that their cause was lost, that their command had failed them, and that their resistance was a futile, suicidal gesture. The ultimate expression of this mockery was, of course, the formal surrender ultimatum delivered on December 22. It was a document steeped in the arrogant formality of European warfare, a condescending lecture from a superior officer to an inferior one. The phrase, "There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation," was not just a statement of fact, it was an insult. It framed the American defense as a foolish delay of the inevitable, a pointless sacrifice of good men. It was the institutional, written version of the taunts from the loudspeakers and the radio. Yet, the German High Command fundamentally misread the character of the American soldier, and particularly the unique esprit de corps of the airborne troops. The paratroopers of the 101st were not a conventional infantry division. They were a band of volunteers, cocky, self-reliant, and bonded by the shared trial of jumping behind enemy lines. The German mockery, rather than breaking them, served to harden their resolve. It became a source of grim humor. They began to refer to themselves proudly as the battered bastards. Axis Sally's threats became a running joke. When a German loudspeaker announced, "We will crush you like bugs," a paratrooper would yell back, "You gotta come down here and get us first." The mockery of the Eagles had backfired. Instead of creating despair, it forged a deeper, more defiant unity. They were no longer just defending a town, they were defending their honor. They were proving a point to the arrogant voices in the fog and to the world. Every shell they fired, every German assault they repelled, was their answer. It was an answer that needed no words, an answer written in blood and frozen mud. But words were coming. An answer was being formulated not in a foxhole, but in a command tent miles to the south, where a man who despised defiance unless it was his own was preparing a reply that would be delivered not with a typewriter, but with the full, thunderous weight of the Third Army. While the men of the 101st Airborne endured their frozen cavalry at Bastogne, a different kind of storm was brewing 60 miles to the south, in the headquarters of the Third Army. Here, the atmosphere was not one of desperate defense, but of frenetic, controlled fury. The epicenter of this storm was General George Smith Patton, Jr., a man who wore his ambition and his piety on his sleeve with equal fervor. For him, the plight of the trapped Americans was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a personal affront to be avenged, a challenge to his military genius, and a test of his conviction that he was an instrument of divine will. The news of the German offensive in the Ardennes had reached Patton even as his Third Army was deeply engaged in a brutal offensive of its own, east of the Saar River. While others at Supreme Headquarters in Versailles were reeling in shock and disbelief, Patton had anticipated the possibility. His intelligence chief, Colonel Oskar Koch, had painstakingly pieced together clues of a massive German buildup in the Eifel region, opposite the Ardennes. Where others saw ghosts, Koch and Patton saw a pattern. Consequently, Patton had already begun contingency planning. His staff, the most efficient in the European theater, had drafted several preliminary orders for a rapid, 90-degree pivot of the entire Third Army, a maneuver of staggering complexity. When the call came from Eisenhower's headquarters on December 19, summoning all senior commanders to Verdun, Patton was not panicking, he was prepared. The conference room in the bleak French barracks was thick with tension and the smell of damp wool and anxiety. Eisenhower, looking weary, opened with the grim question, the present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. It was then he turned to Patton. George, Ike said, I want you to go to the Ardennes and take charge of this situation, and I want you to counterattack with at least 6 divisions. Patton, who had been standing, leaning over his map case, didn't hesitate. General, he replied, his voice a low growl, I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The statement was met with stunned silence, then with skepticism. To disengage 3 divisions from a furious fight, move them over icy, congested roads in winter, and launch them into a new, desperate battle in under 2 days was, in the words of one staff officer, militarily impossible. But Patton was not bluffing. His staff had been working on the logistics non-stop for 3 days. The plan, in its skeletal form, was already in his pocket. This was the plan. But before the plan, there was the prayer. Patton was a profound believer in the concept of destiny and divine intervention. He carried a well-worn pocket Bible and believed himself to be a reincarnated warrior from ages past. To him, God was the supreme commander, and a general's duty was to execute his will with ruthless efficiency. The weather was his enemy. The leaden skies and persistent fog that had grounded the Allied Air Force, the jabots that could have broken the German spearheads, were also hindering his movement and blinding his attack. He needed clear skies. He needed God on his side. On December 23, as his 3 Corps was slamming into the southern flank of the Bulge like a battering ram, Patton did something that would have been ludicrous from any other commander. He telephoned his chief chaplain, Monsignor James H. O'Neill. "This is Patton," the general barked. "Do you have a good prayer for weather? We must do something about these rains if we are to win the war." Startled, O'Neill agreed to compose one. Patton demanded he have it ready for distribution to the entire 250,000-man Third Army by the next day. "See to it," he ordered, "that every man in the Third Army says this prayer. We've got to get not only the chaplains but every man to pray. We must ask God to stop these rains. Pray. Pray. Pray." The prayer itself was a masterpiece of Pattonian pragmatism and piety. It read, "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee, of Thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon Thee that, armed with Thy power, we may advance from victory to victory, and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies, and establish Thy justice among men and nations. Amen." On the back of the prayer card, Patton issued a Christmas greeting to his troops, but it was also a statement of his unshakable belief in the connection between faith and force. He wrote, "We must all pray for victory, and we must not forget to thank God for having granted us our present success." For Patton, the prayer was not a passive plea, it was an active mobilization of spiritual forces to support his military ones. It was the final, crucial piece of his operational plan. And then, on the morning of December 23, as if in direct, divine response to the impertinent demand of a praying general, a meteorological miracle occurred. The low, oppressive clouds vanished. The skies over the Ardennes cleared to a brilliant, hard blue. The cold remained, biting and fierce, but now it was a dry cold. The sun shone. For the first time in weeks, the Allied air forces took to the skies in overwhelming numbers. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs roamed the battlefield, strafing and bombing German columns, breaking up attacks, and bringing a wave of relief to the besieged defenders. The roads, while icy, were no longer quagmires, allowing Patton's armored columns to press north with renewed speed. The prayer had been answered. The plan was in motion. The stage was now set for the final, brutal act. With the skies clear and his divisions slashing into the German flank, Patton could focus on the final objective, breaking the siege of Bastogne. He had the weather. He had the will. He had the men. Now, he needed to give the order that would turn his strategic masterstroke into a moment of legendary, audacious salvation. The trapped Americans had held. The mocker was about to be mocked. And Patton was ready to play his hand. The war room of the Third Army headquarters was a universe away from the frozen foxholes of Bastogne, yet the two were connected by a single, taut wire of will, the will of George S. Patton. Maps plastered the walls, annotated with grease pencils showing the desperate bulge in the Allied line and the slender, probing arrows of his own forces driving north. The air was thick with the smell of coffee, cigarette smoke, and the electric tension of a massive military machine operating at its absolute limit. Patton paced, a caged predator, his ivory-handled revolvers a stark contrast to the utilitarian gloom. He was a man who believed war was an art, and he was now preparing to paint his masterpiece with the most unorthodox brushstroke of his career. The situation was critical, but clear. His 3 Corps, led by the pugnacious Major General John Milliken, was hammering its way north. The 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of the relief effort, was fighting for every inch of the icy, winding roads from Ardennes to Bastogne. They were meeting fanatical resistance from German paratroopers and Panzer grenadiers dug into the villages and woodlines along the axis of advance. The fighting was house to house, tree to tree. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Inside Bastogne, the situation was deteriorating by the hour. The clear skies that answered Patton's prayer allowed for a massive airdrop of supplies on the 23rd, but it also brought renewed and more accurate German artillery and air attacks. The noose was tightening. Time was running out. Patton understood the physics of battle, mass, momentum, and morale. He had the mass. He was building momentum. But morale, that most intangible and critical element, was the key. The morale of the besieged 101st was being sustained by sheer grit. The morale of his own attacking troops was being tested by the brutal, slow grind against a determined enemy. A conventional attack, however forceful, might still take days. Bastogne might not have days. What was needed was not just a push, it was a shock. A psychological earthquake that would resonate through the ranks of both the besieged and the besiegers. It needed to be an act of such audacity that it would break the German will as surely as it would uplift the American. It was in this crucible of pressure and necessity that Patton's unconventional decree was forged. He did not arrive at it through a committee or a staff study. It was a spark in his mind, a product of his deep, almost mystical belief in the power of aggressive action and his theatrical sense of command. He summoned his aides and his senior communications officers. He stood before his map, jabbing a finger at the small dot representing Bastogne. "They're mocking our boys," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "They think they have them in a cage. They think we are a slow, clumsy beast. We will show them speed. We will show them light." He then gave the order. It was not a detailed tactical instruction. It was a concept, a theme, a command that would be executed by the entire Third Army in a synchronized, spectacular display of force. "I want every gun we have," Patton declared, his eyes blazing, "every piece of artillery, from the 105s to the long toms, to fire on the German positions surrounding Bastogne. But not in a controlled barrage. Not for counter-battery fire. I want a symphony. I want a noise like the world is ending. I want it to be the loudest thing ever heard in this war." His staff officers were stunned. It was an enormous expenditure of precious ammunition. It was tactically indiscriminate. It would reveal battery positions. It was, by every conventional military standard, wasteful. But Patton was unmoved. He saw the deeper strategy. "This is not just about killing Germans," he explained, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "This is about sound. It is about light. The men in Bastogne will hear it. They will know we are coming. The Germans will hear it. They will know we are here in force. They will feel it in their bones." The order was transmitted down the chain of command with the urgency of a divine proclamation. To the artillerymen of the Third Army, it was a bizarre but thrilling directive. They had been firing in support of the advance, but this was different. This was a command to unleash hell itself. Across the snow-covered fields and forests of southern Belgium, crews worked feverishly, hauling shells from their dwindling stocks, ramming them into the breeches of their guns. The fire direction centers, accustomed to calculating precise coordinates, were now simply designating large swathes of the German perimeter as target areas. The order was simple: fire for effect. Fire everything. And then, as the short winter day began to fade on December 24th, the order was given. A lone battery fired first, a ranging shot that was swallowed by the silence. Then, another. And then, the world broke open. It began as a distant rumble, like a summer thunderstorm on the far horizon. But it quickly grew, rolling across the frozen landscape, a wave of pure, concussive force. Soon, it was impossible to distinguish individual gun reports. The sound merged into a continuous, roaring avalanche of noise, a deep, basso profundo tremor that vibrated in the chest and rattled teeth. The sky to the south of Bastogne, already darkening with twilight, was suddenly, violently illuminated. It was not the flash of a single shell, but a constant, flickering, hellish glow, as if the very earth had cracked open and was spewing forth liquid fire. The horizon danced with the light of 1,000 man-made lightnings. In their foxholes in Bastogne, the paratroopers of the 101st first felt it as a vibration through the frozen ground. Then they heard it, a deep, sustained roar that was entirely different from the sporadic German shelling they had endured for days. They stood up in their holes, forgetting the cold, forgetting their fear, and looked to the south. They saw the flickering, pulsating light on the horizon, and they knew. It was not a probe. It was not a tentative relief effort. It was the promised thunder. It was the sound of the Third Army. It was the sound of George Patton, and he was not just coming, he was announcing his arrival with the voice of God. A ragged cheer went up from the frozen lines, a sound of pure, unadulterated hope that for a moment, rivaled the roar of the guns. On the German side, the effect was the opposite. The relentless, overwhelming bombardment had no specific target, yet it targeted everything: morale, nerve, the will to fight. It was a display of raw, industrial power that was both terrifying and demoralizing. For the German soldiers who had been told the Americans were weak, who had mocked the trapped eagles, this was a shocking, undeniable statement of American might and resolve. The mocking stopped. In its place was a cold, gripping fear. The trapped Americans had not been abandoned. They had been given the loudest, most powerful answering machine in the world. The order had been given. The symphony of steel had begun its overture. The final movement, the desperate, armored rush to break the siege, was now poised to begin. The colossal artillery symphony orchestrated by Patton was the overture, a declaration of intent heard for miles. But inside the command vehicles and tanks of the 4th Armored Division's spearhead, the reality was a brutal, grinding crawl. The relief of Bastogne was not a single, glorious cavalry charge, it was a bloody, incremental struggle fought by small groups of men in a frozen, hostile landscape. The final, decisive push would not be born from a complex operational plan, but from a single, cryptic, and utterly brilliant command that would become the stuff of legend: play the ball. The man at the sharp end of the spear was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion. His battalion, alongside the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, formed Combat Command R, CCR, the leading element of the 4th Armored Division. Abrams, a tough, brilliant tanker whose name would later be immortalized on America's main battle tank, was the perfect instrument for Patton's will. He was aggressive, innovative, and relentless. But by December 26, even his indomitable spirit was being tested. His units were battered, exhausted, and pinned down by fierce German resistance at the village of Sabret, just south of Bastogne. The direct approach was proving to be a bloody dead end. The command net crackled with frustrated reports. The situation was fluid, chaotic, and dangerously close to stalling. It was in this moment of maximum friction that the commander of the 4th Armored Division, Major General Hugh Gaffey, contacted Brigadier General William H. Morris, Jr., the commander of CCR. The conversation was not a detailed set of orders. It was an imparting of command intent, a granting of permission for audacity. Gaffey understood that micromanagement from the rear would fail. The man on the ground had to be unleashed. The specific phrase, "play the ball," remains shrouded in the fog of war and the passage of time. Some accounts attribute it directly to Patton himself, a piece of his characteristic and often cryptic jargon. Others believe it originated with Gaffey or Morris. Its meaning, however, was crystal clear to every officer who heard it. It was a metaphor from sports, likely American football. To play the ball meant to react to the situation as it unfolded on the field, to be agile, to seize an opportunity, to bypass resistance rather than smash headlong into it. It was an order to stop following the pre-planned script and to improvise. It was permission to be brilliant. This order, transmitted down to the irrepressible Creighton Abrams, was the key that unlocked the door to Bastogne. Abrams received the command not as a vague suggestion, but as a liberation. He immediately grasped its meaning. The main road to Bastogne through Sabret was a killing zone, heavily defended by elements of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division. But what if they didn't take the main road? What if they found a weaker spot? Abrams and the commander of the 53rd Armored Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel George Schock, made a fateful decision. They would bypass Sabret entirely. They would shift their axis of attack to the east, towards the smaller, less defended village of Airdennes. It was a gamble of monumental proportions. It meant leaving a strong enemy force in their rear. It meant navigating secondary, icy roads that might not even support their tanks. It meant plunging into the unknown, trusting that the German perimeter had a soft spot. They were playing the ball. The plan was hastily drawn in the freezing air. The force would be a combined arms team, a company of Sherman tanks from Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, led by the aggressive Captain William Dwight, and a company of armored infantry from the 53rd, under the command of Lieutenant Charles Boggess. Their mission was simple and suicidal: blast through Airdennes, fight through any resistance in the woods beyond, and not stop for anything until they linked up with the 101st Airborne perimeter. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26, the little task force kicked off its attack. The order, "play the ball," had now been translated into violent action. The Shermans roared forward, their engines screaming in the twilight. They hit Airdennes at full speed. What followed was a whirlwind of close-quarters brutality. The lead tank, Cobra King, with Lieutenant Boggess standing in the turret, smashed into the village. American artillery, prearranged in a stunning feat of coordination, dropped a pinpoint barrage directly on the German positions in Airdennes just as the tanks reached the edge of the village. The shells fell so close that shrapnel spanged off the American armor. It was a calculated risk that paid off, stunning the German defenders. The tanks and half-tracks did not slow down. They charged through the village, machine guns blazing, firing high-explosive shells into buildings at point-blank range. They emerged from the northern side and plunged into the dark, ominous woods known as the Bois de Fregat. This was the moment of supreme tension. They were in the gap. They were inside the German ring. In the woods, they encountered desperate German resistance. A German 88mm gun fired, missing the lead tank. American machine gun and cannon fire returned, cutting down enemy infantry. They did not stop to clear the woods. They did not stop for anything. Boggess, from his turret, urged his driver on. Then, through the trees, he saw figures in muddy uniforms ahead, digging foxholes. He raised his binoculars, his heart in his throat. He saw the distinctive, bowl-shaped American M1 helmet. He radioed back to Abrams, "I see Americans. I see American uniforms." He stood up in the turret, exposed to potential fire, and yelled into the gloom, "Come here." "Is that you, Mac?" A tall, gaunt figure emerged from a foxhole. It was Lieutenant Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, 101st Airborne Division. "I'm Lieutenant Boggess, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division." Webster grinned, "I'm mighty glad to see you. The handshake that followed, at 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, was more than a meeting of two soldiers. It was the closing of a circle. It was the answer to the mockery. It was the final, triumphant note in Patton's symphony. The order to play the ball had echoed from the command posts of the Third Army, through the frozen air, into the mind of a bold tank commander, and had culminated in a narrow corridor punched through the German iron ring. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The Eagles were free. The link-up at Airdennes was the climactic chord, but it was not the end of the movement. The corridor carved by Cobra King and the men of the 4th Armored was a slender, vulnerable thread, a surgical incision in the body of the German encirclement. For the symphony of steel to reach its final, thunderous crescendo, that thread had to be thickened, strengthened, and woven into an unbreakable cable. The relief of Bastogne was not complete with a handshake, it was secured with a relentless, brutal expansion of that initial breach, a process that turned a desperate rescue into an irreversible military fact. The moment Lieutenant Boggess met Lieutenant Webster, the battle shifted in character but not in intensity. The goal was no longer to reach the perimeter. It was to hold the lifeline open and to widen it until the entire German noose was shattered. The initial corridor was a mere 250 yards wide in places, a gauntlet of fire dominated by German positions on either side. Every vehicle, every soldier moving through it was exposed to mortar, artillery, and machine gun fire. The Germans, understanding the strategic catastrophe unfolding, reacted with ferocious counterattacks, determined to pinch the corridor shut and seal the Americans inside once more. The task of securing the corridor fell to the armored infantry and engineers who followed behind the spearhead. While the tanks provided a mobile shield, the infantrymen dismounted from their half-tracks and plunged into the frozen woods flanking the road. This was close quarters, savage fighting. The Bois de Frégate became a killing ground of grenade duels, Thompson submachine gun bursts, and the terrifying, hollow crump of German Panzerfausts. Men fought from tree to tree, their world reduced to the few yards of snow-covered ground in front of them. The engineers, under fire, worked to clear hastily laid minefields and improve the road for the vital supply columns that were already queuing up to the south, their headlights blacked out, waiting for the word to move. Inside Bastogne, the sound of the fighting to the south was a continuous, welcome roar. The news of the link-up spread through the foxholes like an electric current. The defiant spirit that had sustained the defenders now flared into something else, aggressive, offensive energy. The paratroopers of the 101st did not simply sit and wait to be saved. They launched local counterattacks of their own, fixing German units in place and preventing them from redeploying to crush the fragile corridor. It was a pincer movement in spirit, Patton's hammer driving north, and the Bastogne garrison's anvil pushing back. The trapped eagles were now striking back with talons bared. Meanwhile, the armored columns of the 4th Armored, now with their route confirmed, began pouring through the corridor in a relentless stream. It was not just tanks. It was tank retrievers, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and ambulances. The sight of these vehicles, grinding their way into the shattered town, was a visceral, tangible end to the siege. The first ambulances to leave Bastogne, filled with the most critically wounded, were a silent, powerful testament to the mission's success. The wounded, who had endured days of agony in frozen cellars, were now on their way to proper hospitals. For the men who watched them go, it was a greater morale boost than any airdropped supplies. The symphony of steel reached its peak volume not in the initial breakthrough, but in the consolidation. American artillery, now with forward observers inside the perimeter and clear lines of communication to the south, began to work with devastating efficiency. The steel rain that the Germans had unleashed on Bastogne was now returned upon them 100-fold. The 105mm and 155mm howitzers of the Third Army fired so incessantly that the barrels of the guns grew hot, glowing dully in the winter night. The fire was coordinated, a precise instrument of destruction that shattered German assembly areas, silenced artillery batteries, and broke up infantry formations before they could even launch a counterattack. The German army, for the first time in the Ardennes offensive, began to lose its tactical cohesion. The relentless pressure from the south, combined with the stubborn resistance from within Bastogne and the increasing attacks from the north by the U.S. First Army, created an impossible situation. The initiative, so decisively seized by the Germans on December 16, had been irrevocably wrested from them. The Symphony of Steel, conducted by Patton, was more than just the noise of his guns, it was the harmonious, violent integration of all arms, armor, infantry, artillery, and air power, working in concert to achieve a single, focused objective. By December 27, the corridor was secure. The siege was officially over. The 4th Armored Division and the 101st Airborne Division had established a firm, continuous front. The mocking, Bastogne pocket was now a fortified Allied salient. A dagger pointed at the heart of the German advance. The symphony did not end with a final note, but faded into the steady, grinding rhythm of continued offensive operations. The mission had shifted from relief to exploitation. The Americans were no longer defending, they were attacking. The ghosts of the Bulge were being exorcised by the relentless, thunderous music of American industrial might and military resolve, a symphony composed in the mind of a praying general and played by the sweat and blood of his soldiers. The handshake at Assenois was a symbolic rupture, but the German noose was a physical reality of steel and flesh, and it would not be truly broken without days of the most brutal fighting the European theater had yet witnessed. The period following December 26 was not a victory parade. It was the violent, methodical unraveling of a siege, a battle to transform a single, bleeding wound in the German line into a gaping, fatal chasm. Breaking the noose meant not just opening a door, but tearing down the entire wall, and the 4th Armored Division and the emboldened 101st Airborne were the instruments of this demolition. The German High Command, reeling from the shock of the breakthrough, reacted with the desperate fury of a wounded animal. They understood that the fall of the Bastogne pocket would unhinge their entire Ardennes offensive. The corridor was the new Schwerpunkt, and they threw everything they had at it. The 5th Fallschirmjäger Division and elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division launched a series of furious, often suicidal counterattacks from the east and west, aiming to sever the American lifeline at its most vulnerable points. The villages of Sabret, Chinon, and Rimonville, which had been bypassed in the initial thrust, became fortresses of German resistance that now had to be cleared, house by burning house. For the American soldier, both the reliever and the relieved, this phase of the battle was in many ways more terrifying than the siege itself. The static, defensive agony of the pocket was replaced by the violent chaos of the offensive. In the frozen fields and dense woods between Bastogne and the 4th Armored's lines, the fighting devolved into 100 small, savage conflicts. Armored columns advancing along the roads were ambushed by well-concealed anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust teams hidden in the treelines. Sherman tanks, burning brightly, became grim signposts marking the path of the advance. The armored infantry, dismounted and moving through the deep snow, engaged in desperate firefights at point-blank range against German paratroopers who were equally determined and equally deadly. Inside Bastogne, the breaking of the noose was felt as a shift from grim endurance to aggressive purpose. The men of the 101st, gaunt and frostbitten, were now fighting with the energy of men who could see deliverance just a few thousand yards away. They launched local attacks to secure the perimeter around the corridor, expanding the American-held territory and pushing the German artillery observers back, denying them direct sight into the town. The link-up allowed for the first coherent resupply and medical evacuation. Ambulances, under constant threat of shellfire, finally began to evacuate the hundreds of wounded who had been suffering in the cellars. The arrival of fresh ammunition, particularly artillery shells, meant the American guns could now answer the German bombardment with overwhelming force, a luxury they had not possessed for a week. The true architects of breaking the noose, however, were the combat engineers and the supply troops. While the infantry and armor fought the enemy, the engineers fought the terrain and the devastation of battle. They worked under fire to clear the roads of destroyed vehicles, minefields, and rubble. They strengthened bridges and laid corduroy roads of logs across icy fields to allow the relentless stream of reinforcements and supplies to flow north. This logistical miracle, the Red Ball Express, in microcosm, was what truly solidified the breakthrough. The corridor was not just a path for a few tanks, it became a main arterial route for the entire Third Army, pumping men and material into the heart of what was once enemy territory. The weather, which had cleared for Patton's prayer, now became a double-edged sword. The clear skies allowed the Allied air forces to dominate the battlefield. P-47 Thunderbolts, flying in endless sorties, prowled the roads leading to Bastogne, strafing and bombing German reinforcements and supply columns trying to reach the front. A single German tank or truck caught in the open was a death sentence. This aerial interdiction was critical. It strangled the German counterattacks at their source, preventing them from massing the necessary force to overwhelm the American corridor. By December 28, the noose was not just broken, it was a memory. The corridor was no longer a vulnerable thread but a broad, secure avenue. The 4th Armored Division had linked up securely along its entire front with the 101st Airborne. The German units that had held the ring were now themselves in danger of being encircled and destroyed. They began a disorderly, fighting withdrawal to the east, harried relentlessly by American armor and J-bows. The battlefield around Bastogne was a horrific landscape of blackened trees, shattered armor, and frozen corpses, a testament to the ferocity of the struggle. The breaking of the noose was more than a tactical victory. It was the definitive turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive, which had aimed for Antwerp, was now irrevocably broken on the frozen fields around a town they had mocked and failed to conquer. The trapped Americans had not only held, but they had become the anvil upon which Patton's hammer had shattered the last, best army of the Third Reich. The order to play the ball had been executed, and the result was a complete and total victory. The mockery was silenced, replaced by the grim satisfaction of survival and the roaring engine of an American army now moving relentlessly forward, its spirit unbroken, its mission clear. The silence that fell over the Bastogne sector in the days following the secure establishment of the corridor was not an absence of sound, but a transformation of it. The mocking, metallic voices from the German loudspeakers were gone. The taunting prophecies of Axis Sally, which had once slithered through the ether into the frozen foxholes, now seemed like the hollow echoes of a forgotten arrogance. The silence of the mockers was the most profound sound of victory. It was a silence born not of ceasefire, but of undeniable, brutal fact. The narrative of German invincibility and American helplessness had been shattered, and in its place was the raw, unassailable truth of the battlefield. The besieged had been relieved, the attackers were in retreat, and the will of the United States Army had proven unbreakable. The German withdrawal from the Bastogne perimeter was a masterclass in swallowed pride. The confident pronouncements of General von Luttwitz and the condescending surrender ultimatum were now relics of a bygone operational reality. The units that had formed the Iron Ring, the elite Panzer Lehr, the 5th Fallschirmjäger, the 26th Volksgrenadiers, were now pulling back, not in an orderly tactical retreat, but under immense pressure, leaving behind a grisly landscape of burned-out tanks, abandoned artillery pieces, and their own unburied dead. The supreme mockery, it turned out, was not in the words they had spoken, but in the outcome they had engineered for themselves. They had encircled an American Airborne division and, in doing so, had allowed themselves to be fixed in place, becoming the perfect anvil for Patton's hammer. Their tactical objective had become their strategic trap. For the men of the 101st Airborne, the silence of the mockery was felt in tangible, life-altering ways. It was the taste of a hot meal, delivered not by a perilous airdrop but by a steady stream of trucks rolling up the Arlone road. It was the sight of clean, professional medical teams setting up field hospitals, replacing the overwhelmed aid stations in cellars. It was the feeling of a dry, warm blanket wrapped around shoulders that had known only damp wool and frozen mud for over a week. It was the deep, uninterrupted sleep, safe in the knowledge that the sentries on the perimeter were now part of a continuous, powerful front, not a last-ditch line of desperate men. The name, battered bastards of the Bastogne pocket, once a term of propaganda, was now worn as a badge of honor, a title earned in the crucible of one of the epic stands in military history. The American High Command, from Eisenhower down, understood the profound psychological shift that had occurred. The relief of Bastogne was immediately and brilliantly leveraged for its propaganda value, but the message was different now. It was not a message of desperate defiance, but of overwhelming power and resolve. Newsreels showed the first supply columns entering the town, the gaunt but grinning paratroopers waving, the unmistakable M4 Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored parked in the town square. The story was no longer Americans trapped, but Americans triumphant. The Nuts episode was recast from a desperate quip into a symbol of unyielding American spirit, the prelude to a stunning military reversal that showcased the flexibility and brute force of the U.S. Army. On the ground, the silence of the German mockery was replaced by the sounds of American confidence and industry. The crunch of bulldozers clearing rubble, the shouted orders of fresh officers, the roar of tank engines being serviced, and the constant, reassuring rumble of friendly artillery firing outward, these were the new sounds of Bastogne. The 101st, though exhausted, began to conduct aggressive patrols, pushing the German rearguards further back, reclaiming the ground that had been their prison. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, professional fury. They had been mocked, and they had answered with rifles, machine guns, and an indomitable will. They had been called doomed, and they had been saved by the sheer audacity of their own countrymen. For the German soldier facing this renewed, reinforced American army, the psychological impact was devastating. The heady optimism of the first days of the offensive, the belief that they were repeating the glory of 1940, had evaporated. The sight of the relentless stream of American men and material, the unchallenged dominance of the Jabos in the sky, and the stunning failure to crush Bastogne revealed a painful truth: the Wehrmacht could no longer compete with the industrial and moral might of the United States. The Ardennes offensive was to be their masterstroke, and it had broken against a single, stubbornly held town. The mockery had been a weapon, and it had exploded in their hands. The ultimate silence fell upon the German High Command. The ambitious plan for Wacht am Rhein was in tatters. The failure to take Bastogne had disrupted their timetable, diverted crucial forces, and ultimately allowed the Allies to blunt and then reverse their advance. The strategic initiative, so dramatically seized on December 16, was now irrevocably lost. In the end, the siege of Bastogne became the defining metaphor for the entire Battle of the Bulge. The German army, for all its initial strength and tactical skill, had overreached. It had grasped for a victory that was beyond its means, and in the process, it had exhausted its last reserves of men, material, and morale. The trapped Americans had not been a victim, they had been a catalyst. Their stand, and their dramatic relief, silenced the last, proud boasts of the Third Reich and heralded the beginning of the final, relentless drive into the heart of Germany. The mockery was not just silenced, it had been answered with a force that would echo all the way to Berlin. The thunder of the guns around Bastogne faded into history, the frozen foxholes melted into the Belgian soil, and the scars on the landscape slowly healed. Yet, the legacy of those critical days in December 1944 did not dissipate, it crystallized. The order that echoed from Patton's command post, "Play the ball," transcended its immediate tactical purpose, becoming a timeless lesson in leadership, audacity, and the immutable physics of warfare where willpower can be the decisive force multiplier. The relief of Bastogne entered the annals of military history not merely as a successful operation, but as a paradigm of how to shatter the impossible. At its core, the legacy is one of command philosophy. Patton's prayer and plan was the ultimate expression of this. He demonstrated that true leadership exists at the intersection of unshakable self-belief and meticulous preparation. The prayer for clear weather was not the act of a superstitious man, but of a commander who understood that every variable, even the metaphysical, must be marshaled in the pursuit of victory. He mobilized his men's spirit as effectively as he maneuvered his divisions. The subsequent order to "play the ball" was the logical extension of this philosophy. It was the ultimate act of trust in subordinate leadership. Patton did not micromanage the final, crucial assault, he set the strategic condition, relieved Bastogne, and empowered his frontline commanders, like Creighton Abrams, with the freedom to achieve it. He replaced rigid control with command intent, understanding that agility and initiative at the point of contact would always trump a perfect plan delivered too late. The legacy also cemented a specific American military identity on the world stage. The Battle of the Bulge was the moment the U.S. Army shed the last vestiges of its green persona. The dogged, professional defense of the 101st Airborne, combined with the breathtaking operational pivot and relentless attack of the Third Army, announced America's arrival as a military superpower capable of both stoic endurance and breathtaking operational art. The nuts response became more than a funny anecdote, it symbolized a new, confident, and uniquely American defiance, unpretentious, blunt, and backed by overwhelming force. The world saw that the American soldier, when tested, possessed a resilience and a resourcefulness that could withstand the worst a veteran enemy could unleash. Tactically, the relief of Bastogne became a textbook study in the orchestration of combined arms warfare under the most adverse conditions. It was a symphony where every instrument had to play in perfect harmony: the static, fixing force, the 101st, the mobile, striking force, the 4th Armored, the suppressive, shaping force, the artillery, and the dominating, enabling force, the Air Corps. The operation demonstrated the critical importance of logistics and engineering, proving that a breakthrough is meaningless unless it can be sustained and expanded. The slender corridor to Bastogne, secured under fire, stands as a perpetual lesson in the need to rapidly consolidate gains and transform tactical penetrations into operational breakthroughs. For the individuals who lived it, the legacy was deeply personal and profoundly shaping. For the men of the 101st, it was the defining chapter of their storied history, the event that forever earned them the nickname, the Battered Bastards, as a title of honor. For Creighton Abrams and the men of the 4th Armored, it was the ultimate validation of their aggressive, can-do spirit. For George Patton, it was the pinnacle of his career, the moment his flamboyant persona was vindicated by a military achievement of the highest order. It proved that his theatrics, his profane prayers, and his relentless drive were not the attributes of a mere showman, but the tools of a master of war. On a broader canvas, the legacy of the audacious command at Bastogne was a strategic death knell for the German war machine in the West. The failure to capture the town and the subsequent shattering of its siege bled the Wehrmacht of its last strategic reserves of armor and veteran infantry. The offensive that was meant to prolong the war and fracture the Allied coalition instead shortened it and solidified the Anglo-American partnership. The resources and morale consumed in the Ardennes were irreplaceable, opening the door for the relentless final thrust across the Rhine into the heart of Germany. Ultimately, the legacy of "play the ball" is an enduring testament to the power of the human spirit in combat. It is a story of a trapped army that refused to quit and a relieving force that refused to be stopped. It reminds us that in the darkest hours, leadership is not about giving detailed instructions, but about providing a clear mission and the freedom to achieve it. It demonstrates that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. And it proves that sometimes, victory does not go to the strongest or the most numerous, but to those who possess the sheer, unyielding audacity to change the game. The order given, the siege broken, the mockery silenced, the legacy of Bastogne is that no position is hopeless, and no obstacle is insurmountable, for those who dare to play the ball.